What if the world's most traditional family turned out to be its most unpredictable? For over 300 years, the British royal family has survived scandal, war, betrayal, madness, reinvention, and the occasional helicopter jump with James Bond. But beneath the crowns and titles lies a history full of absurd pivots, shocking disappearances, and decisions so strange they almost feel deliberate. This isn't just royalty. This is royalty on hard mode. Welcome to 33 of the most insane moments in British royal history, where the only rule is, nothing goes according to plan. And yes, we're starting in 1707. Before we dive into the royal chaos, hit subscribe so you never miss a history lesson disguised as a bedtime story. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? What time is it over there? Midnight? Noon? Witching hour? We want to know who's losing sleep over monarchic madness right along with us. 1. The 1707 Act of Union creates a new monarchy overnight. There was no trumpet blast, no royal decree from the heavens, no dazzling coronation to mark the death of one kingdom and the birth of another. It happened on a Tuesday. The world didn't tilt, but Britain did, quietly, on paper. On May 1, 1707, a single legal document redrew the map of royal identity. The Act of Union formally merged the separate kingdoms of England and Scotland into one nation, the Kingdom of Great Britain. What had once been two thrones awkwardly perched beside each other became a single, unified seat of power. And just like that, the monarch wasn't the King of England or Scotland anymore. He was now king of a country that hadn't existed yesterday. The most surreal part? The man on the throne, Queen Anne, yes, Queen, didn't move an inch. No new palace, no sudden spiritual revelation. Yet overnight, her title changed, her crown changed, her authority changed. The realm she ruled had a new name, a new flag, a new legislative body, and perhaps most unsettling of all, a new sense of self. It was like waking up with a new identity and being told, "Don't worry, everything's fine. You're just a different person now." But why? And why then? The answer, predictably, is power. England, fearing a rival Scottish alliance with Catholic France, decided it was safer to keep their neighbors close, and their monarchies closer. Scotland, meanwhile, was financially devastated after a failed attempt to create its own colony in Panama. The Darien scheme had bankrupted much of the Scottish elite. Joining England promised economic salvation, if at the cost of sovereignty. So under heavy pressure, bribes, and more than a few double dealings, the Scottish Parliament voted itself out of existence. The English didn't so much conquer Scotland as they bought it, with gold and guarantees. That's the official story. What it felt like on the ground was something else entirely. Many Scots viewed the Union as a royal betrayal, a quiet coup in broad daylight. Riots broke out in Edinburgh. Effigies were burned. Protesters hurled stones at politicians. And while Queen Anne's face appeared on new coins minted for Great Britain, her image in Scottish households grew a little colder. The strange part? The Queen herself barely participated. Anne was chronically ill, emotionally isolated, and distracted by the repeated deaths of her children. She wasn't an architect of union so much as its figurehead, a monarch whose body was failing even as her crown was expanding. The symbolism was unavoidable, a sickly queen presiding over the birth of a new kingdom, a quiet revolution wrapped in velvet and paperwork. And yet, this ghost of a political act, bureaucratic, bloodless, and bathed in legalese, fundamentally reshaped the monarchy. From this point on, no British monarch would ever again be just English or Scottish. Their identity was now forever split, stitched together, like the Union Jack, unevenly and with tension still visible in the seams. What began as a legal fusion turned out to be the start of a slow identity crisis, one that continues to ripple through British politics, Scottish independence debates, and royal legitimacy to this day. Because when you forge a monarchy by compromise, it doesn't always stay fused. But of course, the real punchline? Just 7 years later, the monarchy wouldn't even belong to a Brit. 2. The 1714 Hanoverian succession. Imagine waking up to find your new king doesn't speak your language, has never set foot on your island, and considers your culture slightly beneath him, if he considers it at all. That was Britain's 1714 version of Meet Your New Boss. And yes, it was as awkward as it sounds. When Queen Anne died in August 1714, the crown passed, unexpectedly, uncomfortably, and perhaps even unwillingly, to a distant relative, George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover. He was 54 years old, Lutheran, German to the bone, and about 50 heirs down the line if you included all the Catholics. But Parliament had passed a little document called the Act of Settlement in 1701, which said, essentially, no more Catholic monarchs, no matter how close they are to the throne. So George, a Protestant and the great-grandson of James I, got the gig. Not because he wanted it, but because he was legally convenient. When he arrived in England, he brought with him 2 mistresses, a pack of German advisors, and zero grasp of the English language. He didn't even bother to learn it. To him, this was a sideways promotion. Useful, perhaps, but spiritually irrelevant. Britain was not his home. It was his inheritance. The people were baffled. How had the throne of Great Britain, newly minted and fragile, ended up in the hands of a German who couldn't even say God save the king without an accent? This wasn't just a cultural shock, it was a constitutional shockwave. Because for the first time the idea of monarchy as divine, local, and national began to truly disintegrate. The new king didn't care about being British. He didn't understand its traditions, and his reign marked a sharp pivot, from a monarchy that ruled by presence to one that ruled by proxy. George I rarely attended cabinet meetings. He delegated to his ministers. In fact, he barely showed up at all. This opened a power vacuum, into which stepped Parliament. Without realizing it, George helped accelerate Britain's transformation into a constitutional monarchy. He also ignited what would become one of the most unexpectedly durable dynasties in British history, the House of Hanover. His descendants would include madmen, reformers, World War kings, and ultimately Queen Victoria herself. Not bad for a guy whose first love was Hanoverian pork sausages. But the awkwardness didn't end at the coronation. The British court was divided. His son, the future George II, despised him. His subjects mocked his accent, his diet, and his refusal to engage with British life. Satirists had a field day. George became a walking contradiction, a king without charisma, a monarch without mandate, and yet the very image of legal legitimacy. Still, the country adapted, slowly, uncomfortably, and always with a touch of sarcasm. The great irony? In trying to prevent a Catholic monarch, Britain got a German one who acted like a landlord rather than a ruler. But in doing so, it unknowingly paved the way for parliamentary power, political parties, and the prime ministerial system we now take for granted. What started as a linguistic farce ended as a constitutional turning point. And the next time royal instability would rock the nation, it wouldn't be a language barrier. It would be the king's mind itself. And just like that, Britain had a German-speaking king who couldn't read his own coronation oath. If that's not peak royal unpredictability, what is? If you're enjoying the ride so far, don't forget to subscribe. We've got 31 more twists waiting in the wings. And while you're listening, tell us, where are you tuning in from and what time is it there? Are you on your morning commute or deep into a 3 a.m. Wikipedia spiral with a cup of cold tea? We're listening. 3. The 1788-89 Madness of King George III. Crisis. By the winter of 1788, Britain found itself governed by whispers. There were no formal announcements, no official diagnosis, just the unmistakable truth curling behind the heavy velvet curtains of Windsor. The king was not himself. George III had been on the throne for nearly 3 decades. He had weathered wars, rebellions, and the small embarrassment of losing the American colonies. But nothing, not even the surrender at Yorktown, shook the monarchy quite like what happened inside his own mind. Suddenly, unexplainably, and most disturbingly, the king descended into what courtiers delicately called a derangement of understanding. To his doctors, it was a medical anomaly. To his ministers, it was a constitutional crisis with a pulse. The symptoms came in waves: uncontrolled speech, incoherent rambling, erratic behavior, long periods without sleep, and unpredictable mood swings. The man who once prided himself on being a model of duty and restraint was now talking for hours without pause, issuing bizarre commands, and mistaking trees for people. He was, in some sense, still king. But in another, far more immediate sense, he was lost. For the government, the question was as murky as it was unprecedented. What do you do when the sovereign loses sovereignty over himself? There was no roadmap for this. The British Constitution, that famously unwritten thing, had nothing prepared for a monarch who physically lived but politically vanished. Enter the Regency crisis. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger found himself in a precarious position. The logical answer was to name the Prince of Wales, George's own son, as Prince Regent, effectively handing over the powers of the crown. But the Prince of Wales was no one's idea of a stabilizing figure. Bloated with debt, drunk on scandal, and feuding with his father for years, he wasn't just unready for power. He was eager for it, and that made him dangerous. Meanwhile, Queen Charlotte was desperately shielding her husband from public view. Doctors tried everything: bleeding, purging, blistering, all the usual medical nonsense of the age. Nothing worked. George's madness dragged on for months. The press, barred from official updates, turned to gossip. The public, already uneasy after the revolutionary murmurs coming from France, watched nervously. A king who could not rule raised the terrifying specter of instability, and not just political, but existential. What was monarchy, if not embodied in a ruler who could rule? But just when it seemed Parliament would be forced to declare a regency, something astonishing happened. He recovered. By March of 1789, George was lucid again, not only speaking coherently, but addressing Parliament and resuming his duties. His return was framed as miraculous, even divine. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, the nation exhaled. But the damage had been done. Something had cracked beneath the surface of the royal mystique. Kings could bleed, but now they could unravel. And if a monarch's mind could slip away, what else about monarchy might prove fragile? George III would experience further episodes throughout his reign. Eventually, in his final years, a formal regency would be established. But the 1788 crisis was the turning point, a moment when the British people first had to reckon with the uncomfortable idea that royal authority wasn't just sacred. It was mortal and terrifyingly human. And the next great shift in royal destiny wouldn't come from illness, but from a coffin, and the most unexpected royal death in a generation. 4. The 1817 death of Princess Charlotte. In an age where monarchies were expected to multiply like clockwork and dynasties were built on bloodlines, the future of the British royal family was, briefly, wrapped in a single young woman, Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales. She was the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, the only child of the deeply unpopular Prince Regent, later George IV, and the only real hope for a new, more modern, more beloved monarchy. Charming, defiant, intelligent, and unusually popular with the British public, Charlotte was everything her father wasn't: sincere, unspoiled, and warm-blooded. She represented not just continuity, but redemption. A second chance for the crown's reputation, which had been dragged through the mud by years of scandal, war debt, and the Prince Regent's rococo self-indulgence. And then she died. Charlotte's sudden death in November 1817 at the age of 21 wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic catastrophe. She had been pregnant with what everyone assumed would be the next heir to the throne. After a grueling 50-hour labor, the child, a boy, was stillborn. Hours later, Charlotte herself died from complications. In the space of one long, agonizing night, the entire line of succession collapsed. There was no royal baby, no mother, no heir. The nation went into mourning unlike anything it had ever seen for a royal. Shops closed, black armbands sold out. Even the stock market dropped. Britain's emotional outpouring was not just about grief, it was about fear. With Charlotte gone, the future of the monarchy was suddenly blank. Because here's the thing, while the royal family was certainly not short on children, nearly all of them were illegitimate. George III had many sons, and most of them had spent the last few decades fathering offspring out of wedlock while avoiding anything resembling duty. The Prince Regent had no legitimate children beyond Charlotte. His brothers were aging bachelors with mistresses and scandalous debts. None had done their constitutional homework. In other words, there was no next in line. The Hanoverian dynasty had spent years partying through Europe, but now, with Charlotte gone, they were forced to stop and face a terrifying truth. No heir, no monarchy. So, the great royal marriage race began. George III's sons, several now in their 40s and 50s, scrambled to find Protestant princesses and produce legitimate heirs as if they were breeding horses under royal deadline. The winner of this strange and desperate competition? Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. In 1819, they had a daughter. Her name was Victoria. The irony is cruel. The death of one beloved young royal, Charlotte, opened the path for another to eventually define a century. Without Charlotte's untimely death, there would be no Queen Victoria, no Victorian era, no empire under her name, just a very different history. And so, from the silence of a royal nursery emerged the shadow of a different destiny, one born not in triumph, but in absence. The monarchy's future would now depend on a baby girl not yet born, in a family that barely knew how to raise one. And as fate would have it, this future queen would soon face more threats in a single lifetime than most monarchs did in 10. Starting with the first bullet. 5. Queen Victoria survives. 8 assassination attempts, 1830s, 1880s. You'd think surviving one assassination attempt might be enough excitement for a lifetime. Maybe 2 if you're particularly unlucky or historically significant. But Queen Victoria? She endured 8. Not all of them well-planned, not all of them competent, but 8 separate occasions where someone pointed a weapon at the sovereign and decided she should no longer be breathing. And she lived through every single one of them. The first attempt came in 1840. Victoria was just 21, newly married, and already one of the most watched women in the world. She and Prince Albert were riding through London in an open carriage, a tradition that screamed visibility over safety, when a man named Edward Oxford stepped out and fired 2 pistols at her. Both missed, or weren't loaded, or misfired, or all 3. Oxford was immediately arrested, smiled the whole time, and was eventually declared insane. But the incident set the tone. Victoria didn't flinch. Literally, she was applauded for her composure. The Queen's calm demeanor during the attack became its own kind of legend. The stoic figurehead, untouched by chaos, unmoved by threat. But inside the palace, it landed differently. It was a reminder that monarchy, while draped in ritual and ceremony, was physically vulnerable, subject to the whims of disturbed minds and loaded pistols. Over the next 4 decades, the pattern continued. Another man with a gun in 1842, a cane sword attack in 1849, a pistol misfire in 1850, a revolver pulled in 1872, a man rushing her carriage with a broken chair leg in 1872 again, and on it went. Some assailants were driven by political rage, others by delusion, and a few seemed more interested in becoming famous than becoming successful. One man even claimed he was the rightful king of England and simply wanted to reclaim his throne by, what else, shooting the woman in it. Victoria's responses evolved. Early on, she played the heroine. Later, she showed flashes of fury. After a failed attempt in 1850, she wrote in her journal that she was more angry than alarmed. By the 1870s, there was no more public surprise, only private frustration and heightened security. But the public? They adored her for it. Every survival reinforced her image as unshakable. Every failed attempt became a national rallying point. The Queen, untouched and undeterred, grew into a kind of living symbol of endurance. She wasn't just surviving her attackers. She was absorbing them into the myth of monarchy. They fired. She waved. The empire rolled on. But beneath the spectacle, a deeper transformation was taking place. These repeated attacks subtly rewired the monarchy's public image. Gone was the invulnerable divine monarch of previous centuries. In its place stood something more human, more exposed, more relatable. A queen who could be targeted and who chose to keep appearing in open carriages anyway. Security was tightened. Protocols were adjusted, but Victoria never fully retreated. In a strange way, the attempts on her life only cemented her authority. Not because she was immune, but because she endured. And that endurance became the core of her reign. Still, the most serious threat to Victoria's monarchy wasn't a gun or a madman. It came quietly, wrapped in mourning black, when her beloved Prince Albert died. Because survival, as she would learn, is not the same as living. 6. Victoria withdraws from public life. After Albert's death, 1861. When Prince Albert died on a bleak December evening in 1861, it wasn't just a royal consort who vanished. It was the sunbeam from the monarchy's carefully arranged portrait. Queen Victoria didn't just lose her husband. She lost her mirror, her moral anchor, her political advisor, her daily routine, and her reason for being a public person. In the wake of his death, she disappeared, physically, emotionally, and politically. This wasn't a short sabbatical. This was a near-total withdrawal from public life, lasting years. And in an era when the monarch's visibility was central to national identity, it wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a constitutional emergency hiding behind black curtains. Victoria dressed in mourning black and would never again wear color in public. She retreated to Windsor, to Balmoral, and eventually to Osborne House. Crowds no longer cheered her. Parliaments no longer heard from her. State functions were avoided, royal engagements declined. She even skipped her own son's wedding. To the outside world, the monarchy had gone mute, but grief was only part of it. What most people didn't understand at the time, what many still don't, is that Albert wasn't just her consort. He had been the operational brain of the monarchy, a master of details, schedules, memoranda, moral authority. Victoria had always ruled through instinct and emotion. Albert provided ballast. Without him, there was no one to keep the machine oiled, and so it seized. The newspapers grew agitated. By the late 1860s, they were calling her the Widow of Windsor, a sarcastic moniker for a monarch who appeared to have given up on monarchical duties. Republicanism, never a dominant force in Britain, began to stir again. Pamphlets circulated asking why the nation should fund a sovereign who would not sovereign. Parliament grew restless. Even her own ministers, once sympathetic, began to push her toward re-engagement. But Victoria refused. In her journals, she compared Albert's death to an earthquake, and her life afterward to a prolonged dreamlike exile. She wasn't just mourning, she was frozen in time. The image of royal authority, once wrapped in ceremonial presence and divine obligation, was now cloaked in personal despair and Gothic stillness. Yet somehow, the institution endured. Perhaps it was inertia. Perhaps it was British stoicism. Or perhaps it was the slow, quiet resilience of a nation learning to separate the person of the monarch from the office they held. During these years of absence, Britain didn't fall apart, but it did begin to evolve. The machinery of constitutional monarchy became more autonomous. Ministers operated more freely. The government began to expect less involvement from the crown. In her retreat, Victoria inadvertently helped create the modern monarchy. Less a ruling force, more a symbolic one. Eventually, very eventually, she re-emerged. Tentatively at first. A public appearance here, a speech there. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 was a triumphant return of sorts, but the damage had already left its mark. The monarchy had come dangerously close to fading from relevance, not from scandal, nor rebellion, but from silence. Still, Victoria's absence had taught the monarchy something crucial. Survival didn't always come through power. Sometimes it came through adaptation, through letting go. But in the shadows of the empire, another blow was already forming. One not from grief, but from blood. A royal would soon be killed in the name of politics, and for the first time in modern history, the monarchy would find itself on the front line of terror. 7. The 1882 assassination of Lord Mountbatten in Ireland, shocking royal political entanglement. It was the kind of Sunday morning that promised quiet, calm waters, coastal air, and a boat ride off the sleepy coast of County Sligo. But in the waters of Mullaghmore, Ireland, that illusion exploded, literally, when a bomb hidden aboard a small fishing boat tore through the calm, killing Lord Louis Mountbatten and 3 others, including his 14-year-old grandson. It was August 27, 1979, and though Mountbatten wasn't a reigning monarch, he was much more than a symbolic royal. He was the royal insider, the Queen's cousin, Prince Philip's uncle, Prince Charles's mentor and surrogate father figure, a World War II naval hero, and the last Viceroy of India. His death wasn't just shocking, it was historically radioactive. But to understand why, we have to rewind nearly a century, to the first time a Mountbatten assassination shook the monarchy. Because contrary to popular belief, Lord Louis Mountbatten wasn't the first politically entangled member of the royal family to face deadly consequences. Back in 1882, a century earlier, a different royal figure with a Mountbatten connection, Lord Frederick Cavendish, Queen Victoria's nephew-in-law, was assassinated in Dublin's Phoenix Park. He had just arrived in Ireland as Chief Secretary, a symbol of Britain's imperial governance, when he was attacked by Irish nationalists in broad daylight. His murder shocked both the government and the royal family, revealing just how combustible the mix of royalty and colonial politics could become. Though Cavendish wasn't as close to the throne as Louis Mountbatten would later be, the message was unmistakable. Royal blood, no matter how ceremonial, was not off-limits in times of political crisis. The 1882 assassination marked the first time in modern memory that a figure tied directly to the monarchy was murdered as part of a nationalist political statement. And it wasn't a one-off. It triggered a wave of fear in Westminster, hardened policies in Ireland, and ushered in a period of mutual suspicion between the Crown and its increasingly restless subjects across the Irish Sea. But what made this moment truly unsettling wasn't just the violence. It was the ambiguity. Cavendish wasn't a tyrant or a warmonger. He was by all accounts a moderate, even a peacemaker. But he wore the crown's authority, and in a colonial context, that made him a target. His assassination became a moral riddle the monarchy never quite solved. How do you represent peace while symbolizing empire? The psychological impact on Queen Victoria was severe. She saw it not just as a political murder, but as a personal affront. Letters from the time show a monarch genuinely shaken, not just by the loss, but by the realization that her family could now be fair game in geopolitical violence. The protective bubble of royal abstraction had been pierced. And beneath the pomp, a creeping realization began to take root. Royalty could no longer float above the fray. In a changing empire, royals were not just symbols. They were actors, sometimes unwilling, sometimes unaware, on the most dangerous stages of history. This was the birth of the political royal, and it would echo through to the 20th century, all the way to Louis Mountbatten's deadly boat ride. Because the monarchy wasn't just being targeted for what it did, but for what it represented, and sometimes what it tried to hide. That lesson would only become more ironic with the next royal figure, one who was never supposed to rule at all, let alone become the face of British diplomacy. 8. Edward VII's unexpected transformation, from playboy to respected king, 1901. For over half a century, he was the national punchline in waiting. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, known to society simply as Bertie, spent the better part of 59 years as the royal family's resident embarrassment, a man whose very name became shorthand for wasted potential. He was a playboy, a gambler, a gourmand, a man of many mistresses and few accomplishments. If Queen Victoria symbolized duty, mourning, and moral restraint, her son seemed determined to embody the opposite. It's hard to exaggerate how low public expectations were for him. Victoria famously blamed Bertie for the early death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, after discovering the prince had been consorting with an actress while at military camp. She never quite forgave him. For the rest of her life, she denied him political responsibility, confined him to ceremonial appearances, and kept him miles away from real influence. The British people saw him as idle, scandal-prone, and unfit. His frequent appearances in the society pages, draped in French brocade, cigars in hand, only fueled the image of a man born to wear a crown but incapable of holding it. So when Queen Victoria finally died in 1901 and Edward ascended the throne at the age of 59, the collective sigh across Britain was more of concern than celebration. Few expected a man so allergic to restraint to survive the job, let alone reform it. And then, he surprised everyone. Edward VII's reign, though brief, 1901 to 1910, became a strange and unexpected pivot point in the monarchy's evolution. Gone was the cloistered, brooding atmosphere of the Victorian court. In its place emerged a more cosmopolitan, accessible, and diplomatically savvy monarchy. Edward didn't try to imitate his mother's moralism, he dismantled it. And oddly, it worked. He was fluent in multiple languages, intimately familiar with every major European court, and disarmingly charming. The very traits that had once made him a scandal became his political tools. He brokered key understandings with France and Russia, laying diplomatic groundwork that would prove essential in the years leading to World War I. They called him the Peacemaker King, a title that would have seemed laughable a decade earlier. More than that, he modernized the institution of monarchy itself. He knew the power of image in an age of photography. He revived ceremonial grandeur, not as ego, but as theater, a way to stage stability for an increasingly restless public. Coronations, processions, uniforms, rituals, these weren't just relics to Edward. They were tools of political soft power, and he wielded them expertly. The irony, of course, is almost too perfect. The man once criticized for his lack of seriousness ended up giving the monarchy a new sense of gravity. The prince who had been sidelined for decades gave the crown a second act. But his transformation also raised a troubling question. If the monarchy could change this dramatically with just a shift in personality, how solid was its foundation really? Was kingship a matter of bloodline or performance? That uncertainty wouldn't go away. In fact, it would deepen when his son, King George V, made a single decision that would change the royal family's identity with a stroke of a pen and a name stripped of its past. 9. George V changes the royal family's name to Windsor, 1917. In the spring of 1917, amid the carnage of World War I, King George V stood at the center of a quietly escalating crisis. Not one of troops or trenches, but of perception. His royal family, British in ceremony, imperial in reach, bore a name that, in the current climate, sounded a lot less regal and a lot more enemy. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It rolled off the tongue like a saboteur's confession. It didn't help that German Zeppelins were bombing London, or that the Kaiser waging war against Britain was the king's first cousin, or that angry crowds were chanting slogans outside Buckingham Palace, questioning whether their monarch was truly one of them. A royal name that once suggested European prestige now stank of disloyalty. The palace, once a symbol of British endurance, now looked vaguely foreign, architecturally German, genealogically undeniable. For George V, whose quiet demeanor often masked a fierce instinct for survival, the choice was clear. The monarchy could not afford to seem like it belonged anywhere else. Not during wartime, not when the battlefield stretched from Flanders to Fleet Street. So, on July 17, 1917, in an act of symbolic self-amputation, George V issued a royal proclamation. Henceforth, the royal house would no longer bear the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It would be known instead as the House of Windsor. The name was carefully chosen. Windsor sounded British, felt ancient, and carried the weight of stone. It evoked the centuries-old castle overlooking the Thames, not a minor duchy in Bavaria. It was as much an invention as a revelation, a brand crafted for wartime unity. And just like that, the monarchy rebranded itself not just to survive but to become British. The timing was strategic. Anti-German sentiment was at a peak. Newspapers were already skewering royal titles. The Daily Mail ran headlines demanding action. Even the king's own cousin, Prince Louis of Battenberg, had stepped down from his naval command because of his German name. He too was rebranded, becoming Lord Louis Mountbatten, a name that would echo through the royal narrative for generations. The transformation was seamless on the surface, but beneath it was a deep existential question. How much of monarchy is simply appearance? If royal identity could be altered so dramatically with a new name, what did that say about its authenticity? Did heritage matter less than image? And if so, was the crown becoming less a lineage and more a costume? The public, for the most part, approved. The name Windsor stuck. It felt right, patriotic, clean. And George V, though never flamboyant, had managed to execute one of the most important acts of monarchical self-preservation in modern history, not with force, but with paperwork. Yet the irony lingered. A family of German princes had seamlessly become icons of Britishness overnight, a sleight of hand so effective it was barely questioned. But if a name could be changed so easily, what else could be changed? What else was negotiable? That question would explode just 2 decades later, when a king would decide that being king was optional and love was not. 10. The 1936 abdication crisis. Edward VIII chooses love over empire. In theory, kings don't quit. They reign. They endure. They inherit crowns as if by divine inevitability, and they wear them until death, preferably on horseback or in an oil painting. But in 1936, King Edward VIII did the one thing a British monarch was not supposed to do. He resigned. And he did it not for war, not for scandal, not for illness, but for love. Or something that resembled it closely enough to bring the entire monarchy to the edge of collapse. Edward had only been king for 326 days. He never had a coronation, never settled into the rhythm of statecraft. His short reign was a blur of modern flair and old-guard discomfort. He was charming, photogenic, and unmistakably popular with the public. But to the establishment, he was a constitutional headache waiting to happen. His views were politically unfiltered, his friendships eyebrow-raising, and most of all, his personal life was completely unmanageable. At the center of that storm stood Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite with a penchant for dry wit, expensive clothes, and utterly disastrous timing. When news broke that the king intended to marry her, it set off a national crisis that no one had planned for and no one could control. The Church of England, of which the king was the supreme governor, flatly forbade the marriage. Divorce was still morally radioactive in British high society, and to marry a woman with 2 living ex-husbands was, to the clergy, nothing short of sacrilege. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, made it clear. Wallis as queen was impossible. Not inadvisable. Impossible. Edward, however, refused to back down. He had fallen into the kind of stubborn passion that royal protocols were never designed to handle. For him, the crown was negotiable. Wallis was not. And so came the unthinkable. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII addressed the nation via radio. His voice, low, deliberate, unmistakably aristocratic, spoke the words that detonated royal precedent. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. It was the first time most of his subjects had ever heard a monarch speak aloud, and the first time they'd heard one abdicate. In the span of 10 minutes, the monarchy was rewired. Edward was now the Duke of Windsor, exiled to a life of half-relevance and awkward Christmas cards. His younger brother, the shy and stammering Albert, soon to be George VI, was thrust unwillingly into the role. A second son made king, not by lineage, but by necessity, and the monarchy itself rattled. Because if a king could walk away for personal reasons, what else might future monarchs decide was optional? Public duty? Constitutional neutrality? Emotional restraint? The abdication crisis was more than a royal romance gone rogue. It was the moment the British monarchy fully confronted the 20th century and lost a little of its mystery. The crown had been exposed as negotiable, even disposable, and in the decades to follow more secrets would surface, some romantic, others political, and one buried in classified files that would cast the abdication in a far more sinister light. 11. The discovery of Wallis Simpson's secret FBI and MI5 files, 1930s-40s. For decades, the story of Edward VIII's abdication was sealed in amber. A tragic love affair, a modern king undone by ancient rules, a sovereign who chose passion over protocol. It was romantic, heartbreaking, vaguely scandalous, and neatly wrapped in sentiment. But then came the files. Not fairy tales, not tabloids. Government surveillance files. In the 1990s and early 2000s, long classified documents began to surface from the dusty basements of the FBI and MI5, and with them came a wave of uncomfortable reframing. What had once been the monarchy's most infamous love story now began to look a lot more like a security risk in a tiara. It turns out Wallis Simpson had been watched for years by British intelligence, by American agencies, and likely by other governments too. Officially, the surveillance began out of concern over the potential diplomatic embarrassment her relationship with the king might cause. But the contents of the files revealed far more disturbing suspicions. Wallis, according to some of these documents, had maintained close relationships with a number of powerful men, including Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi Germany's foreign minister. There were allegations, never conclusively proven, but never fully dismissed, that she and Ribbentrop had been romantically involved before the war. More damning was the implication that both she and Edward had pro-German sympathies, or at the very least, harbored views that alarmed Allied intelligence. MI5's files hinted at the couple's reckless communication habits, their possible carelessness with sensitive information, and Edward's dangerously naive views about Hitler's intentions. Some believed the Duke of Windsor had been so anti-communist and so embittered by his forced abdication that he saw fascism as a preferable alternative to Bolshevism, and democracy as little more than theater. At one point during World War II, when the couple was living in Portugal, British intelligence became so concerned about a potential Nazi plot to use the ex-king in a puppet government that Churchill personally intervened. Edward was quickly shipped off to the Bahamas, nominally as governor, but more accurately in diplomatic exile. Safe, watched, and far from Europe. And then there were the Americans. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, kept tabs on Wallace long after the abdication, filing reports that ranged from the credible to the bizarre. Hoover, famously paranoid and self-important, was obsessed with the possibility that the Duchess of Windsor might be part of something larger, something subversive, destabilizing, maybe even traitorous. Was any of it definitively true? The files raise more questions than they answer. There's no smoking gun, no telegram signed by Hitler. But the existence of so many layers of suspicion changes the texture of the story. It turns the fairy tale into something else entirely. Oh, national security melodrama wearing gloves and pearls. It also reframes the abdication itself. What if Edward wasn't just stepping down for love? What if the British establishment wanted him gone? What if the king's greatest sin wasn't romance, but recklessness? That's the uncomfortable possibility these files whisper, that the monarchy wasn't saved despite Edward's departure, but because of it. And as Edward faded into semi-ironic exile, his shy younger brother was forced onto the throne, an accidental king with a stammer, a cigarette habit, and a world war on his doorstep. 12. George VI's accidental king reign. He wasn't supposed to be king, not in theory, not in temperament, and certainly not in his own estimation. Albert Frederick Arthur George, known privately as Bertie, was the dutiful, soft-spoken second son, the one meant to support the crown from the sidelines, not wear it. He had spent his life shrinking from the spotlight, nursing a paralyzing stammer, and quietly enduring a father who rarely masked his disappointment. And then, his older brother quit. The abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 didn't just rupture royal tradition, it thrust Bertie into a role he neither wanted nor felt prepared for. One day he was the Duke of York, an unassuming family man. The next, he was King George VI, sovereign of an empire trembling under the weight of political instability and a fast-approaching war. The public watched with quiet apprehension. This wasn't a man bred for charisma. His speeches were halting, his demeanor stiff. He walked like someone who had borrowed his own body. The memory of Edward, charming, confident, scandalous, still hung in the air like perfume. And yet, as the country lurched toward one of the darkest periods in its history, it was George VI who slowly, awkwardly, and with no small amount of humility, became the symbol of national endurance. His reign wasn't marked by grand declarations or sweeping reforms. It was marked by presence. He and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, famously stayed in London during the Blitz, refusing to flee even as bombs fell around Buckingham Palace. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she reportedly said afterward. "Now I can look the East End in the face." It was the kind of sentiment that struck deep, especially from a monarchy long accused of being distant. George's image, once unremarkable, became emblematic. He was a man struggling visibly, through speech, through stress, through a war that consumed nearly every hour of his reign. And in that visible struggle he became relatable, even admired. He didn't dazzle, he endured. Behind the scenes, though, the pressure was brutal. His stammer, immortalized later in films and popular lore, was more than a speech impediment. It was a lifelong embodiment of anxiety and self-doubt. Every broadcast was a psychological minefield. His health deteriorated under the weight of stress and heavy smoking. But he refused to retreat. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the monarchy itself was now built less on mystique and more on perception. And perception required performance. By the end of the war, George VI had become something extraordinary. A man who turned vulnerability into strength. He had entered the throne reluctantly and would leave it prematurely, dead at 56 from lung cancer. But in those 16 years, he reshaped what kingship could look like. Not grand, not infallible, but human. And that humanity became the cornerstone of his daughter's reign. Because when he died in 1952, the throne passed not to a grizzled heir or seasoned statesman, but to a 25-year-old woman on a foreign tour whose life, until that moment, had been mostly ceremonial. Overnight, she became Queen Elizabeth II. Not by training, not by choice, but because history had left her no alternative. 13. Princess Elizabeth becomes queen, unexpectedly at 25, 1952. There was no royal music playing, no grand procession, no throne in sight. Just a young woman perched in a treehouse in Kenya, watching elephants pass below, completely unaware that her entire life had just shifted under her feet. It was February 6, 1952. Princess Elizabeth was on a royal tour with her husband, Prince Philip, standing in for her ailing father, King George VI. They had spent the day in the Aberdare Highlands, staying at a lodge known, somewhat prophetically, as Treetops. That night, while she slept above the branches, George VI died quietly in his sleep back in Sandringham, and by the time Elizabeth awoke, she was queen. A crown passed not by ceremony, but by phone call. It is said, perhaps apocryphally, that Elizabeth climbed up into the lodge as a princess and climbed down as a queen. No trumpets, no fanfare, just the silent, irreversible transfer of power. A metaphor tailor-made for history books, and for the lonely weight of modern monarchy. She was 25. She hadn't even unpacked her adulthood. Her coronation wouldn't come for another year, but the reign began that very moment. She was the most photographed woman in the world, suddenly made the most watched sovereign, in a post-war Britain teetering between imperial decline and suburban dreams. The empire was already unraveling. India was gone. Kenya, where she had just become queen, was on the brink of violent rebellion. The world she inherited was shifting fast, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to stand still just long enough for the monarchy to keep up. Elizabeth had been raised for visibility, not sovereignty. Her education was domestic, her upbringing cautious. She had memorized ceremonial lines, waved like a metronome, and perfected the art of showing up. What she hadn't prepared for was sudden sovereignty in a geopolitical crisis. Churchill, 77 years old and still clinging to power, greeted the new queen with both reverence and paternal doubt. Parliament watched warily. The Commonwealth waited. But from the very first moment back in London, Elizabeth made her position clear. She would serve, not dictate, not reinvent, but serve. Her first address as queen was composed, deliberate, and shockingly solemn for someone so young. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakably a declaration of duty. Her coronation in 1953 was a made-for-television spectacle, the first of its kind, and a quiet stroke of PR genius. Millions tuned in to watch the ancient rites unfold through modern technology. And just like that, the monarchy rebranded again. A medieval institution, now piped into living rooms via BBC broadcast. But underneath the seamless optics lay the same paradox that would haunt her reign. How does a person represent timelessness in a world addicted to change? At 25, Elizabeth became the figurehead of continuity in an age of disruption, and while her composure would define her public persona for decades, it came at the cost of a personal life lived almost entirely in the shadow of obligation. Still, her reign had barely begun when the cracks started to form, not around her, but around the people connected to her. Because not every royal understood the quiet strength of restraint. Some chased influence, others chased pleasure, and one in particular would stumble into a scandal that would shake the monarchy's reputation to its core. 14. The 1963 Profumo affair's royal fallout. It began, as many national scandals do, with a party. Not the kind with cake and hats, but the kind where aristocrats, politicians, spies, models, and minor royals drink too much in marble drawing rooms and pretend the Cold War isn't happening outside. In 1963, Britain found itself tangled in one of the most sordid political storms of the 20th century, the Profumo affair. And although it wasn't technically a royal scandal, it had all the ingredients of one: sex, secrets, betrayal, and a dangerously thin membrane between the crown and the chaos that surrounded it. At the heart of the scandal was John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, who lied to Parliament about an affair with Christine Keeler, a young model with links to a Soviet naval attaché. This alone would have been enough to collapse a government minister's career. But as investigators dug deeper, they found themselves brushing up against names that sent a chill through Buckingham Palace. Because one of the main social connectors in the Profumo scandal was Dr. Stephen Ward, an osteopath and well-connected society man who threw the kind of parties where royal cousins and Cold War operatives accidentally mingled. And among his many illustrious acquaintances, Prince Philip. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, no verified affair, no legal scandal, but that didn't stop the press, or the public, from indulging in a round of dangerous speculation. A single photograph of Dr. Ward standing near the Duke of Edinburgh was enough to send palace aides into crisis mode. Damage control began not with facts, but with distance. Prince Philip denied all inappropriate connections, and no solid proof ever surfaced. But the whiff of implication lingered. The royal family, long seen as aloof and untouchable, now found itself perilously adjacent to the era's most volatile elements: espionage, sexual politics, and a press corps freshly energized by scandal. This wasn't just a crisis of privacy. It was a threat to the image of moral stability the monarchy had carefully cultivated since Elizabeth's ascension. For a queen who had anchored her reign on composure and neutrality, the Profumo affair was a clear and unsettling signal. The post-war deference that once shielded the royal family was fading. The British public was growing more curious, more cynical, and far less patient with mystery. Even an unconfirmed connection could spark panic. The fallout from the Profumo affair led to resignations, a suicide, a government weakened, and a cultural shift that would crack the facade of Britain's elite institutions. But in royal circles, the lesson was colder and more strategic. Proximity to scandal is just as dangerous as scandal itself. It also marked a slow but irreversible change in the monarchy's public posture. The royal family began retreating further behind tightly managed appearances. Media access was narrowed, personal lives more carefully staged. The days of informal closeness between royals and society elites were drawing to a close. But just as one door of royal privacy was slamming shut, another figure in the royal family was about to fling it wide open, marrying into the firm not with discretion, but with flashbulbs, cameras, and a career of his own. A commoner, an artist, and a husband to the Queen's rebellious sister. 15. Lord Snowdon's role as a royal photographer, 1960s. When Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, it marked the first time in centuries that a British king's daughter, or in this case the Queen's younger sister, married someone without a title, a land portfolio, or a bloodline traceable to Charlemagne. Instead, she married a photographer, not a court painter, not a noble amateur, a professional, a man who made his living capturing images, many of them risque, many of them modern, and none of them vetted by royal tradition. Anthony was made Earl of Snowdon after the wedding, but he never stopped being what he was before, a camera-swinging outsider, and that was exactly what made him dangerous and necessary. At first it all looked romantic. Princess Margaret, long cast as the royal family's glamorous wild card, had found her bohemian match. Their wedding was televised, watched by millions, and felt like something new, a break from the monarchy's carefully controlled emotional silence. For a moment it seemed the royal family had opened its windows, if only to let in a breeze of 1960s cool. But Snowdon didn't just marry into the family, he brought the outside world with him. And not just the glamorous bits. He brought cameras behind the velvet curtain. His photography was startling in its intimacy. He captured the Queen smiling without posing, Prince Charles looking like a real child rather than a princeling, and Princess Anne mid-scowl. He didn't stylize them as monarchs. He humanized them, often in black and white, often just off balance enough to be real. For the monarchy, which had spent centuries cultivating an image of divine remove, Snowden's work was radical, sometimes thrilling, sometimes uncomfortable. He didn't mock the institution. He just refused to mythologize it. This wasn't simply a matter of aesthetics. It was a shift in power. In an age of television, magazines, and mass media, the royal image had become currency. Controlling it meant controlling public sentiment. And for a brief moment in the 1960s, a royal family member held the camera instead of posing for it. But the friction was inevitable. Snowden didn't blend in. He clashed with courtiers, scowled at formal dinners, and smoked in places where no one else would dare. He brought artists, writers, and left-leaning intellectuals into royal circles, people who viewed the monarchy not as sacred, but as curious. The press adored the drama, often speculating that Margaret and Antony's volatile relationship was more performance than partnership. Their marriage, already cracking by the late 60s, devolved into a spectacle of infidelities, shouted arguments, and barely concealed contempt. But even in its decline, the Snowden experiment left its mark. It had shown that royalty could flirt with the real world, and in doing so, might become a little more real themselves. That tension between myth and modernity would only deepen. As the century unfolded, Snowden's camera gave the public a glimpse. But soon, another event would slam that lens open, one in which royal authority would be questioned not at home, but on the far side of the world, where the Queen's name still held power, and the illusion of control would fracture in an instant. 16. The 1975 Australian constitutional crisis. It started like a civics lesson and ended like a constitutional car crash. On November 11, 1975, in the sunlit corridors of Canberra's Parliament House, the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, arrived for what he believed would be a routine meeting with the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, the Queen's official representative in Australia. Instead, Kerr handed him a letter. It wasn't ceremonial. It was a dismissal. The Prime Minister of a sovereign, democratically elected government had just been fired by a man who answered not to voters, but to a throne on the other side of the world. It was one of the most astonishing and misunderstood moments in modern constitutional history, and it cast an unexpected and unsettling spotlight on the enduring power of the British Crown. To understand the scale of the shock, it's important to grasp what Australia was in 1975, a modern, independent country with its own government, but still technically a constitutional monarchy under the British Crown. The Governor-General was the Queen's stand-in, and while their powers were largely symbolic, a few constitutional powers remained in the fine print. Kerr decided to invoke them. The immediate trigger was political gridlock. Whitlam's government had stalled in the Senate, and budget bills couldn't pass. The opposition refused to yield. The country hovered on the edge of a constitutional shutdown, but rather than allow a political solution to unfold, Kerr acted preemptively. He summoned Whitlam, dismissed him from office, and appointed the opposition leader as caretaker prime minister, all without informing the Queen in advance. Legally? Possibly defensible. Politically? Nuclear. The move unleashed a storm. Protests broke out across Australia. Whitlam stood outside Parliament and delivered one of the most iconic speeches in Australian political history, declaring, "Well, may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General." The phrase became legend. The monarchy, once a quiet, symbolic backdrop, was now a central player in a political drama half a world away from Buckingham Palace. Back in London, the royal family did what it always does in a storm: stayed silent. The Queen, when she finally responded, issued a careful letter emphasizing her non-interference. The decision, she said, had been entirely the Governor-General's. She did not approve or disapprove. she simply remained. But the damage was done. The 1975 crisis forced Australians and others in the Commonwealth to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Queen's powers still existed on paper, and under the right or wrong conditions, they could be used. Even in a modern democracy, even without warning, the monarchy had always walked a delicate line, above politics but never irrelevant. In this case, the ambiguity collapsed. The Queen's representative had intervened directly in a democratic process, and for many Australians, that turned the monarchy from a benign symbol into a foreign veto. In the years that followed, debates about republicanism surged. The crisis didn't destroy the monarchy, but it did puncture its aura of harmlessness. It reminded everyone that the crown was more than ceremony. It was power held in reserve. And as that realization rippled outward, another royal figure, closer to the Queen's heart and family, would soon face a much more personal kind of shock. This time, not from political dismissal, but from devastating violence, when an old royal friend met his end by the sea. 17. The 1979 Lord Mountbatten assassination. By the late 1970s, Lord Louis Mountbatten had become more than just royalty adjacent. He was a walking embodiment of the 20th century's contradictions. A decorated war hero and former Viceroy of India, a naval officer with a talent for ceremony, and the elder statesman of the British aristocracy who also happened to be Prince Philip's uncle, Prince Charles's mentor, and the monarchy's closest link to the old imperial order. He was everything the monarchy had once been, and perhaps still wanted to be. And then, on August 27, 1979, he was gone. Mountbatten's assassination wasn't just shocking. It was deliberate, symbolic, and surgical. That morning, while on holiday in the sleepy fishing village of Mullaghmore, County Sligo, he set out on his small wooden boat, the Shadow 5, for what should have been a routine outing with members of his family and a local boy who helped as deckhand. Unknown to them, a member of the Irish Republican Army, IRA, had slipped aboard the night before and planted a radio-controlled bomb beneath the deck. When the boat was just a few hundred yards offshore, the device was detonated. The explosion tore through the vessel, killing Mountbatten, his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull, a local teenager named Paul Maxwell, and the Dowager Lady Brabourne, who died from her injuries the next day. The attack was swift, devastating, and timed to a moment of apparent peace. The IRA quickly claimed responsibility, issuing a statement that framed the murder as a blow against British imperialism. To them, Mountbatten wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of colonial rule, of British authority in Ireland, and of the monarchy's entanglement in everything the Republican movement opposed. His death wasn't just personal, it was political theater, staged with brutal clarity. The British public, and the royal family especially, were stunned. For Charles, it was a profound emotional loss. Mountbatten had been a surrogate father, a mentor who had guided him through military training, and even encouraged his romantic entanglements, sometimes too enthusiastically. His influence on the heir apparent was enormous, and suddenly he was erased. For the monarchy, the assassination shattered any illusions that the royal family existed safely above political violence. The idea that a senior royal figure could be blown up on a summer holiday felt surreal, until it wasn't. Security protocols were re-evaluated. Royal travel became more restricted. The symbolic role of monarchy now came with very real risks. But it also forced the public to re-examine the monarchy's visibility. Mountbatten had been public, informal, even chatty. He walked among ordinary people with little protection, the way royals used to when the world moved slower. His death marked a permanent shift toward more guarded, controlled royal interactions. The crown would still be seen, but no longer touched. Yet even in death, Mountbatten left behind unresolved questions. How much of his assassination was about his role as a royal, and how much was about what he represented? Could the monarchy ever truly separate itself from the politics of its past? The violence shocked Britain, but it also foreshadowed a new kind of royal fame, one not based on duty or lineage, but on celebrity. And the next figure to redefine the monarchy's public image wouldn't do so through statesmanship, but through flashbulbs, fashion, and a global obsession no one saw coming. 18. Diana's global celebrity status, 1980s. The royal family had always been famous, but Diana Spencer turned that fame into something else entirely, something louder, brighter, and exponentially more complicated. Before her, royalty meant reverence from a distance. After her, it meant being chased through flashing cameras, splashed across newsstands, and dissected in every possible tone. Adoration, gossip, suspicion, awe. She married Prince Charles in 1981, stepping into the most scrutinized role on earth besides the throne itself, the future queen consort. At just 20 years old, she wasn't simply entering royal life, she was consumed by it. Yet within months, it was clear that Diana wasn't merely going to perform the role, she was going to redefine it. From the moment she emerged in that famously over-the-top wedding gown, she was everywhere. Not just in Britain, not just in Europe, but everywhere. Her face sold magazines. Her tears led nightly news broadcasts. Her fashion dictated trends in Tokyo, Toronto, and Sao Paulo. She became the most photographed woman in the world, and not by accident. Diana wasn't just a passive recipient of media attention. She understood it. She played it. Sometimes subtly, sometimes not. A glance through lowered lashes, a hand rested protectively on a child's shoulder, a carefully chosen color. It all became part of a carefully intuitive performance. Unlike the royal family, who historically cultivated mystery, Diana offered intimacy. She gave the public emotion, vulnerability, even discomfort. And the public couldn't get enough. She made palace life seem fragile, human. She cried in interviews. She spoke candidly about her struggles. She visited AIDS patients when others wouldn't, hugged children in landmine zones, held hands where protocol advised gloves. Each gesture chipped away at the institution's polished shell and simultaneously built her legend. The monarchy wasn't designed to share the stage, but suddenly it had to. Diana's celebrity didn't orbit the crown, it overshadowed it. Crowds cheered louder for her than for Charles. Headlines became hers by default. And within the palace, this wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. Because behind the scenes, the story was far less glamorous. Her marriage was straining under the weight of unmet expectations, infidelity, and media pressure. But in the public eye, the myth of Princess Diana only grew. She wasn't royal in the old sense. She was accessible, imperfect, modern. And to a new generation, she was royalty done right. This didn't just complicate things for the palace, it threatened the entire model. Diana had proven that a royal could become a star, independent of crown or constitution. If the people's affections could be won without lineage, what was the monarchy for? Tradition? Titles? The wave from the balcony? The institution tried to adapt, but it could never fully catch up. The cameras had turned their lenses from the throne to the individual. And that shift, quiet, sudden, irreversible, would only accelerate in the years to come. Because after the fairy tale began to fall apart, the royal family faced something they hadn't encountered in generations. A total image collapse. Not just one scandal, but many. A whole year of chaos. And the Queen herself would come to call it her horrible year. 19. The 1992 Annus Horribilis disasters. In a speech marking her 40th year on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II took the microphone at London's Guildhall and, in her famously measured tone, uttered a phrase no one expected. 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. A horrible year. In Latin, delivered like a funeral joke in a palace drawing room. But she wasn't exaggerating. By the time December rolled around, 1992 had burned through the monarchy's reputation like a slow-moving constitutional bonfire. It was the year that the firm, that famously stoic, emotionally evasive institution, became messy, public, and human in all the worst ways. 3 royal marriages unraveled in the space of months. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson separated amid a storm of tabloid attention. Ferguson, already struggling with her role inside the royal family, became press cannon fodder when compromising photos of her with an American financial advisor appeared on front pages. The image of a duchess sunbathing topless while having her toes kissed by a man who wasn't her husband became instantly iconic, and instantly scandalous. Then came Princess Anne's quiet but still notable divorce from Mark Phillips. The Queen's only daughter had always kept a lower profile, but even her exit from marriage was read as a symptom of deeper dysfunction. The fairy tale images of stable royal families were peeling away like cheap wallpaper. But the loudest, most damaging saga by far was the unraveling of Charles and Diana. What had once been packaged as a royal love story had become a public soap opera. In June 1992, author Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story, a sensational tell-all biography that revealed her depression, eating disorders, and unhappiness within the royal marriage. The palace dismissed it as lurid speculation, until it emerged that Diana herself had cooperated in secret. The image of a cohesive, disciplined royal household was now a publicly dysfunctional family drama, unfolding in real time. And then, because apparently the monarchy wasn't finished being punished that year, Windsor Castle caught fire. On November 20th, the Queen's beloved residence went up in flames. The fire burned for 15 hours, destroying over 100 rooms and causing millions in damage. Symbolically, it felt like divine irony, the monarch's ancestral home quite literally on fire, as the family's reputation crumbled around it. The British public, already strained by economic recession and political discontent, began to question why they were footing the bill for repairs. That tension forced another shocking first. The Queen agreed to start paying income tax on her private income, something no reigning monarch had done since the 1930s. It was a survival move, wrapped in civility. By the end of the year, the monarchy had been dragged from its pedestal into the realm of everyday scandal. It wasn't untouchable anymore. It was real, and real wasn't flattering. But the worst hadn't happened yet. The most devastating blow wasn't in 1992. It came a few years later, sudden, tragic, and so emotionally explosive that it shook the monarchy's very legitimacy. Not a fire in a castle, but a crash in a tunnel. And this time the crown would face something it had never truly prepared for. The wrath of the people. 20. The Queen begins paying taxes. 1992. For most people, paying taxes is a fact of life. It's as routine as brushing your teeth or ignoring the fine print on a parking ticket. But for centuries, the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom lived outside that civic obligation, floating above the inland revenue like a crown glinting in the sun. The sovereign, by tradition, did not pay income tax, not because they couldn't, but because, well, they didn't. And then came 1992. It was already the Queen's annus horribilis, the year of burned castles, crumbling marriages, toe-sucking tabloid mayhem, and the slow-motion train wreck of public opinion. The royal family was no longer seen as untouchable. It was seen as expensive, dramatic, and increasingly optional. The fire at Windsor Castle in November became the tipping point. Not because of the flames, but because of the bill. When the public learned that repairs to the Queen's beloved residence might be covered by taxpayers, something snapped. Polls turned. Newspapers sharpened their knives. Letters poured in. The British people, already enduring a recession, began asking aloud, why are we paying for the monarchy's damage control, literal and figurative, when the monarchy doesn't even pay taxes like the rest of us? The palace, sensing the temperature shift, knew something had to change. The idea of the monarchy as symbolic was one thing, The idea of it as subsidized aristocracy with tax immunity was another. And so, on November 26, 1992, just 6 days after the Windsor fire, the Queen made a move that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. She volunteered to begin paying income and capital gains tax. The announcement was carefully worded. It wasn't technically a reversal of law. She was, after all, still exempt by legal definition. But it was a voluntary agreement with the government, structured to make her financial contributions align with those of an ordinary citizen earning similar private income. It was, in effect, a gesture of voluntary accountability. The move was unprecedented in modern royal history. Not since Edward VII quietly paid some taxes on investment income, without saying much, had a monarch so directly engaged with the financial obligations of the people she reigned over. It wasn't just about money, it was about optics, legitimacy, and survival. Critics argued it was too little, too late. Supporters called it a pragmatic gesture, but for the monarchy, it marked a pivotal turn. No longer could the crown hide behind antique precedent. It now had to perform humility, if not in palace renovations, then at least in its tax returns. The Queen's decision also set a tone for the coming decades. As the monarchy drifted into the era of 24/7 media, scrutiny would only intensify. Every royal gesture, financial or otherwise, would be judged not by tradition, but by public expectation. Transparency, once a luxury, became a necessity. Still, even with this concession, trust in the monarchy was wobbling. The family drama hadn't slowed. The tabloids were insatiable. And one unresolved fault line remained just beneath the surface: Diana. The crown's brightest star had become its most unpredictable force. And just 5 years later, the very institution trying to modernize would be shaken by the event that nearly broke it: a tunnel, a crash, and the coldest silence the crown had ever offered. 21. Princess Diana's death and the public backlash. 1997. In the early hours of August 31, 1997, a black Mercedes-Benz crashed inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. The woman inside, Diana, Princess of Wales, was declared dead shortly after. News anchors went silent. Crowds gathered outside royal palaces. Grown men cried on park benches. Something had split, suddenly, violently, between the monarchy and the people who had once seen it as eternal. But the most remarkable part of that day wasn't the tragedy itself. It was what came next: the silence. For nearly a week, Buckingham Palace offered no official comment. No black flag was flown at half-mast. No statement from the Queen. While the rest of the country, indeed much of the world, was plunged into mourning, the institution that had defined Diana's public life responded with stillness. The woman who had once married into the royal family had given birth to its future and had become its most beloved and controversial figure, had died violently and young, and the crown said nothing. In that void, the public filled the space with anger. Outside Kensington Palace, flowers piled waist-high. People brought letters, poems, photographs, teddy bears. Many left notes not just for Diana but to the royal family. Where are you? Say something. Do you even care? These weren't just grief offerings. They were accusations. It was the first time in living memory that the monarchy's emotional detachment was seen not as dignified, but as inhuman. The same stiff upper lip that had once been praised for guiding the nation through war now looked like ice. And at the center of it all stood the Queen. Staying at Balmoral with Princes William and Harry, shielding them, yes, but also remaining absent from public view. In the press, the narrative twisted. Was she cold, out of touch? Did she resent Diana even in death? Royal protocol had no chapter for this. Diana had been stripped of her HRH title upon divorcing Charles. She was, officially, a private citizen. But the public had already rewritten that story. To them, Diana wasn't former royalty. She was people's royalty, their Queen of Hearts, as she had once famously, and perhaps prophetically, called herself. Eventually, the palace caved. The Queen returned to London. She gave a live broadcast. Rare, sober, carefully phrased, speaking as a grandmother more than a sovereign. She called Diana an exceptional and gifted human being. She spoke of lessons and loss and unity, but the damage was done. The monarchy had blinked during its greatest test of emotional legitimacy, and the country had noticed. For the first time, the institution appeared vulnerable, not just to scandal or politics, but to public opinion. And what the public wanted was evolving. They no longer looked to the crown for stoicism. They wanted connection, real emotion, accountability. The idea that royalty could suffer in private was becoming obsolete in the era of televised grief. Diana's death didn't destroy the monarchy, but it forced it to modernize emotionally or risk losing its moral license altogether. And as the dust settled, another kind of shock emerged, less emotional, more constitutional. Because the royal family was about to walk headfirst into an ethical crisis of its own making, one involving cameras, conflict of interest, and a very modern problem, media monetization. 22. Prince Edward's production company scandal, 2001. For a family defined by ceremony and distance, the camera has always been both a blessing and a threat. It projects power, but it also invites scrutiny. And by the early 2000s, with reality TV booming and media access expanding like a time-lapse infection, the British royal family was being filmed more than ever, by everyone, including, somewhat controversially, themselves. Enter Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest son. Less known than Charles, less rebellious than Andrew, and less photographed than Diana, Edward had carved out an oddly specific niche for himself. Royal-turned-media executive. In 1993, he founded Ardent Productions, a television company meant to produce historical documentaries, arts programming, and, very delicately, royal content. On paper, it looked like a modest, culturally respectable venture, something safe, something tasteful, and most importantly, something that would allow Edward to engage with the media without being swallowed by it. But Ardent quickly became a case study in what happens when the line between public duty and private profit gets too blurry. The core problem wasn't that Edward ran a media company. It was what the company chose to film, and who. In 2001, Ardent found itself at the center of a media firestorm after its crew was caught filming at St. Andrews University, where Prince William had just begun his studies. The university had requested media leave him alone. The palace had negotiated a press blackout to allow him privacy. All major outlets agreed, all except Ardent. Edward's production team, operating under the umbrella of his own company, was discovered attempting to film near William's campus, violating the very agreement the royal family had brokered. The optics were radioactive, one royal brother being used as tabloid bait by another's camera crew. The monarchy, long obsessed with image management, now looked like it was monetizing itself from the inside. The backlash was immediate. Palace officials reportedly erupted. William, normally reserved, was furious. Prince Charles, already protective of his son's privacy, issued a complaint. The Queen was said to be deeply disappointed. And the press, never one to pass up irony, had a field day. A royal violating royal privacy? The incident exposed a fundamental contradiction. Royals are supposed to be above commerce. Their value lies in their symbolism, not their hustle. But Edward, perhaps trying to remain relevant in a world where ribbon cutting wasn't enough, had wandered into ethically gray territory. He had acted not as a prince, but as a producer. Shortly afterward, Edward stepped down from day-to-day operations at Ardent. The company limped along for a few more years before folding quietly, but the damage lingered. It had raised uncomfortable questions about modern monarchy. What happens when royals want to be individuals? When they want careers, brands, projects? Can you be a working royal and a working professional? The Ardent debacle was a cautionary tale. not just for Edward, but for the entire institution. The monarchy couldn't afford to compete with media. It had to control it. Carefully, quietly, always with plausible deniability. But the illusion of control wouldn't last. Because just 1 year later, the royal family would suffer an emotional blow that no camera crew could anticipate. A sudden double loss, stripping away 2 pillars of memory, identity, and emotional continuity in a single, quiet year. 23. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. Dying in the same year, 2002. In the spring of 2002, as the Queen was preparing to celebrate her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne, the royal family was hit with a 1-2 emotional punch that landed with eerie precision. The deaths of Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother, just 7 weeks apart. One was the monarch's only sibling, the other her mother. Together they had formed the Queen's original circle of loyalty, the closest people in her famously guarded orbit. And now, they were both gone. First came Princess Margaret, who died on February 9, 2002, at the age of 71. Once the glamorous, rebellious younger sister, the chain-smoking, hard-partying counterpoint to Elizabeth's porcelain poise, Margaret had become something of a tragic figure. Her health had declined for years. Strokes, lung issues, and the slow unraveling of a life that had once promised so much freedom and instead delivered confinement, scandal, and quiet disillusionment. But Margaret was more than just a royal curiosity. She was a reminder of what the monarchy refused to be. When she fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man, the palace said no. The church said no. And in the end, Margaret herself said no, choosing duty over love, and spending the rest of her life walking a tightrope between loyalty and loneliness. Her death wasn't a national shock. It was a quiet end to a noisy life. And for the Queen, it was the loss of her only sibling, the only person who had known her not as a monarch, but simply as Lilibet. Then, on March 30th, 2002, the Queen Mother died. She was 101, a living relic, a woman who had shaken Hitler's hand in a receiving line and then refused to flee London during the Blitz. For decades, she had embodied a particular flavor of royalty, smiling, floral-hatted, indestructible. She drank gin before lunch, lived through 5 reigns, and walked the line between ceremonial figurehead and national grandmother with quiet precision. Her death was not unexpected, but it symbolically hollowed out the monarchy's emotional core. She had been the royal family's fallback matriarch, the one who made monarchy feel almost domestic. Losing her, so close to Margaret's passing, made 2002 feel less like a jubilee and more like a generational wake. For the Queen, it was the cruel symmetry of loss. Her sister and mother, gone just as she was meant to celebrate continuity and national service. The juxtaposition was unmissable. 50 years of reign shadowed by the fading faces of the people who had shaped her most private self. Yet in true Windsor form, the Jubilee went on. Processions were held, flags waved. But the tone was subtly altered. The pageantry had an undercurrent of elegy. The Queen herself seemed a little older, a little more mortal, a little more alone. The monarchy, once defined by its unchanging faces, was entering a new era. And that era would soon see the reemergence of an old scandal, this time rewritten, reframed, and presented not as shame, but as second chances. Because a love story once exiled from the throne was about to walk back through the front door, officially, publicly, and in a civil ceremony that would force the crown to redefine what royal marriage could look like. 24. Prince Charles marries Camilla. After decades of controversy, 2005. For over 30 years, it was the love story that dare not speak its name, or rather, dared to whisper it in phone calls, tabloid headlines, and awkward glances across polo fields. The relationship between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles had haunted the monarchy like a scandal in slow motion. Too familiar to ignore, too delicate to resolve, It hovered over Charles's public life like an unfinished sentence. But in April 2005, that sentence finally ended with a signature. Charles married Camilla, not in Westminster Abbey, not beneath stained glass and ancient vows, but in a modest civil ceremony in Windsor Guildhall, with a smaller, quieter blessing held afterward in St. George's Chapel. It was not quite a royal wedding. It was a royal compromise. And yet, it was also historic. Because what took place that day wasn't just a personal milestone. It was the monarchy grudgingly admitting that modern love could come with baggage and still be legitimate. To understand the magnitude of the moment, you have to go back to the 1970s. Charles and Camilla had met young. They had, by most accounts, been genuinely in love. But for reasons of timing, rank, and royal protocol, the relationship had fizzled, or rather, been snuffed out. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. Charles eventually married Diana. The rest is tabloid archaeology. But Camilla never fully disappeared. Their connection continued behind the scenes, growing ever more awkward as Charles's marriage disintegrated in the blinding light of press intrusion and personal incompatibility. By the time Diana famously told the BBC in 1995, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," Camilla was no longer a rumor. She was a national fixation. For years she remained deeply unpopular, seen as the other woman, the homewrecker, the reason the fairy tale fell apart. Palace aides, ever aware of public sentiment, kept her in the background. When she and Charles finally began appearing in public together in the late 90s, it was tentative, choreographed, fragile. And yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Camilla was rehabilitated, not through a dramatic rebranding, but through sheer persistence and a quiet refusal to flinch. She didn't give interviews, she didn't defend herself, she just remained. By 2005, the British public had softened, if not fully forgiven. The Queen gave her blessing, carefully. And so Charles, at long last, married the woman he had loved all along. Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall, not the Princess of Wales, a title that still belonged to public memory. The couple's official line was that she would never be queen, only princess consort. That too would change. But in the moment, what mattered was that the monarchy had just crossed another unspoken line. It had allowed emotion to triumph over protocol, retroactively, awkwardly, but undeniably. The institution had long demanded that its heirs marry for image. Now it was admitting, publicly, that image alone was no longer sustainable. The royal family had learned to bend. And bending, unlike breaking, offered survival. But just as the monarchy was adjusting to love in the spotlight, another royal was preparing to test the institution's boundaries, not with romance but with something far more radical. War, secrecy, and a frontline deployment no one saw coming. 25. Prince Harry. Serving in war zones in secret, 2006 to 2008. In the age of tabloid royalty and ceremonial ribbon cutting, the idea of a senior royal secretly deployed to an active war zone sounded more like a scene from historical fiction than a modern-day headline. But between 2006 and 2008, Prince Harry, third in line to the throne at the time, did exactly that. Twice. And unlike many royal stories, this one began not with scandal, but with intent. Harry had always been the less scripted royal, known for his impulsiveness, his party boy reputation, and his unfiltered remarks. Few expected him to take military service seriously. But beneath the press caricature, there was something more grounded, something forged in the quiet aftermath of his mother's death and the hyper-surveillance that followed. The armed forces offered what palace life never could: structure, anonymity, and purpose. He trained at Sandhurst. He took it seriously. And then in 2007, after months of classified planning, he was deployed to Helmand Province, Afghanistan, as a forward air controller with the British Army. No press releases, no photo ops, only a handful of officials and military commanders knew the truth. For 10 weeks, Prince Harry lived in basic conditions, wore no royal insignia, and coordinated airstrikes in a live combat zone as just another officer. The illusion held until it didn't. In February 2008, an American website leaked his presence. The Ministry of Defense, faced with the risk of making him and his unit a high-value target, immediately pulled him out. Just like that, the mission was over. The British media, which had maintained a voluntary blackout out of respect and national security, now had their story. And it exploded. The headlines were, for once, celebratory. The public loved it. Harry had done something bold, dangerous, and completely unroyal in the best way. He'd shown up. He'd gotten his boots muddy. He'd eaten with his comrades. He hadn't demanded special treatment. And he hadn't told anyone. It was a shock, but the good kind. But what it revealed was deeper than a PR win. It showed just how far removed modern royalty had become from actual service. In an era where duty often meant gala appearances and hospital visits, Harry had literally gone to war. And in doing so, he disrupted the public's expectations of what a royal could or should be. Then, in 2012, he did it again. This time as an Apache helicopter co-pilot and gunner, again in Afghanistan, again with secrecy, again with very real risk, and again he was pulled out early due to media leaks. But the point had been made. Twice. Harry's military career changed how people viewed him, and how he viewed himself. It marked the beginning of a long, increasingly strained relationship with the institution he was born into. Because while the monarchy thrives on symbolism, Harry had tasted something it couldn't provide: authenticity. His service left the crown with a subtle dilemma. In showing that a royal could be more than ornamental, Harry also reminded the world how rare that actually was. And as the monarchy tried to modernize on its own terms, it was Harry who had done the most modern thing of all: show up, do the job, and say nothing. But soon, the cameras would come back, and this time, they wouldn't be chasing secrecy. They'd be chasing a wedding, one that would turn into a global spectacle, reigniting monarchic nostalgia and temporarily rebooting royal relevance. Live-streamed, hashtagged, and sealed with a balcony kiss. 26. The 2011 royal wedding sparks a global revival of monarchic popularity. On April 29, 2011, an estimated 2 billion people tuned in to watch Prince William marry Catherine Middleton. The numbers were surreal. Every continent watched, every major network broadcast, every newspaper, every website, every royal correspondent was aligned like planets orbiting a singular event. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a global media phenomenon dressed as tradition. And for a moment, it worked. The monarchy, bruised by years of scandal, loss, and dwindling relevance, suddenly looked hopeful again. The emotional power of the moment was undeniable. William, the eldest son of Diana, was marrying for love, publicly, openly, and with the full approval of the Queen. Catherine, famously a commoner, albeit from a wealthy family, represented something new: a royal bride with no aristocratic blood, no titles, and no royal scandal trailing behind her. She had no pedigree, just poise. The tabloids, ever hungry for class-based controversy, searched for flaws and found none. The story practically wrote itself. But underneath the fairy tale optics was something far more strategic. The Windsors were facing an existential problem: public engagement. By the early 2010s, monarchic approval ratings had dipped among younger generations. Social media was eroding the monarchy's mystery. Celebrity culture had outpaced aristocracy. And younger royals weren't seen as symbolic figures. They were seen as potential influencers. Relevance had become a moving target. William and Catherine's wedding, then, became a kind of brand reset, a high-production reintroduction of the monarchy as accessible, elegant, and globally resonant. The couple looked relatable, smiling, slightly nervous, clearly in love. William in his red Irish Guards uniform, Catherine in her now iconic Alexander McQueen gown. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey was laced with royal tradition but streamlined for modern tastes. Even the Queen looked pleased. The press loved it. Tourists flooded London. Merchandise exploded. Mugs, tea towels, commemorative coins. Social media turned the event into a real-time cultural moment. For many viewers, especially those who had grown up watching Diana's tragic story, the wedding felt like a narrative correction, a second chance for royal love to succeed without implosion. But the real success of the event wasn't just emotional. It was institutional. The monarchy had managed to take a deeply private commitment and turn it into a global advertisement for continuity. It didn't matter that the couple would live in renovated royal apartments or that security costs ran into the tens of millions. What mattered was the illusion of simplicity. The message was clear. The monarchy could evolve without collapsing. Catherine, for her part, handled the transition into royal life with tactical brilliance. No scandals, no missteps, just carefully managed appearances, charitable initiatives, and a wardrobe that sparked daily headlines. She wasn't just joining the firm, she was rebranding it. The monarchy basked in the glow. Approval ratings rose. A new generation began to see the royals not as dusty relics, but as aspirational figures, glamorous yet grounded. But even as the cameras cut away from the balcony kiss and the world returned to normal, something unexpected was coming. Because just 1 year later, the monarchy would do something no one saw coming. Make fun of itself, and in the process, reveal a sovereign with a remarkably modern sense of timing and parachuting skills. 27. The 2012 London Olympics. Queen jumps from helicopter with James Bond. Moment. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II was many things. A living symbol, a constitutional anchor, a human embodiment of post-war continuity. But on July 27, 2012, during the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, she became something no one expected, a punchline, and not by accident. That night, the world was watching. London had the spotlight, and director Danny Boyle, best known for Slumdog Millionaire and Trainspotting, was tasked with producing the most theatrical opening ceremony in Olympic history. What he delivered was part pageant, part fever dream, part national therapy session. Industrial revolutions, NHS nurses dancing, a giant Voldemort, Mr. Bean, and then Her Majesty the Queen and James Bond parachuting into a stadium. Technically, it wasn't really her jumping, but for a split second, millions of viewers believed it was. And more importantly, the Queen had agreed to play herself in the lead-up to the stunt, an unprecedented move. The skit, which opened with Daniel Craig's James Bond striding through Buckingham Palace to collect the monarch, ended with them boarding a helicopter, flying across London, and parachuting into the Olympic Stadium as the crowd erupted. Just before the stunt double landed, the real Queen appeared in her skybox, unflinching, expressionless, but undeniably in on the joke. It was a cultural detonation. For a sovereign famous for her composure, privacy, and absolute avoidance of anything that even smelled like personal publicity, this was a seismic shift in tone. The Queen, the very image of establishment stoicism, had just endorsed national self-mockery on live global television. And the world loved it. The press went wild. The skit dominated global headlines. Memes exploded. YouTube views soared. The Queen had become a kind of ironic celebrity, not through scandal, but through satire. It was a rare moment when the monarchy didn't just tolerate humor. It deployed it with surgical precision. Behind the scenes, it was a masterstroke of PR. The Queen's team, long seen as risk-averse and ceremonial, had agreed to something bold, unexpected, and utterly humanizing. In that brief sketch, she wasn't just a monarch. She was a participant in the national story, not above it. And the message stuck. Even at 86 years old, the Queen wasn't detached. She could play along. She could wink at tradition without dismantling it. The monarchy didn't have to be either stale or scandalous. It could be self-aware, at least for a moment. That Olympic evening, Elizabeth II reminded the world of something Britain had long understood, that the monarchy endures not because it never changes, but because it knows when to surprise you. But even as the Queen was winning hearts with a well-timed parachute gag, a more serious shift was coming. Just 1 year later, the monarchy would take a step that quietly rewrote the rules of succession, a 1,000-year tradition undone with a signature. Because for the first time in royal history, being a girl would no longer be a disqualifier. 28. The 2013 Succession Act ends male primogeniture. For centuries, the British monarchy followed a simple, ironclad rule. If you're male, you go first. The system of male primogeniture meant that younger sons outranked older daughters, no matter how competent, charismatic, or constitutionally appealing the girls might be. A princess could be born first, speak first, walk first. But the minute a little brother showed up, she moved down the line like a polite afterthought. And then, in 2013, that rule finally changed. The Succession to the Crown Act, passed under the coalition government, was a quiet revolution. It ended male preference primogeniture for royal births after October 28, 2011, meaning that from that point forward, the firstborn child, regardless of gender, would be first in line. The monarchy, that most ancient of institutions, had finally acknowledged a truth the rest of the world had figured out long ago. Girls aren't backup plans. The timing was precise, if not a little strategic. Prince William and Catherine were expecting their first child, and speculation was at fever pitch. What if the baby was a girl? Would she rule only until a son came along? Or would the crown commit to full equality? The act ensured that no matter who arrived, their place would be determined by birth order, not chromosomes. As it happened, Prince George was born first, followed by Princess Charlotte. Under the old rules, Charlotte would have been bumped down the moment Prince Louis arrived. Under the new ones, she stayed exactly where she was, fourth in line. But the act did more than just shift names on a family tree. It symbolically uprooted a deeply embedded contradiction in the monarchy itself. This was an institution that had survived and even thrived under iconic queens, Elizabeth I, Victoria, Elizabeth II, yet still codified male preference in its foundational laws. The Succession Act corrected that hypocrisy, albeit centuries late. More surprisingly, the change wasn't just about gender. The act also removed the ban on royals marrying Catholics, a relic of the 1701 Act of Settlement, which had been drafted during a time when Protestantism was treated less like a faith and more like national security policy. In 2013, Parliament finally decided that a royal marrying a Catholic wouldn't immediately plunge the nation into civil war. Another minor miracle. The public reaction was generally supportive but muted. After all, most people had no idea such an outdated law was still active. To many, it felt like catching a glimpse of the plumbing beneath Buckingham Palace. Ugly, rusted, but still somehow functioning. Still, for an institution obsessed with continuity, the change was massive. It showed that the monarchy, when nudged hard enough, could adapt, and not just with symbolism or charm, but with actual legislative reform, not pomp, policy. The irony, of course, was that while the crown finally embraced gender equality on paper, it still had centuries of tradition to unravel in practice. Equality is easy to legislate. It's much harder to stage manage in a world of tiaras, uniforms, and inherited power. But this modern monarchy was learning to evolve one rule at a time. And as the new generation of royals began to step into their roles, one older royal was preparing to step out, not with scandal or controversy, but with something even more shocking in royal circles, a retirement letter. 29. Prince Philip retires at age 96, 2017. For more than 7 decades, he had been the ever-present shadow beside the crown. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, wasn't just the Queen's consort. He was her consort for longer than most monarchies survive entire dynasties. And yet, on May 4, 2017, at the age of 96, he did something truly rare in royal tradition. He retired. Not from life, not from scandal, from duty. The announcement came in classic royal fashion, vague, formal, and a little stiff. A statement from Buckingham Palace declared that the Duke would no longer carry out public engagements, starting in the autumn. No health crisis, no scandal, no forced exile. Just a man, nearly a century old, deciding that after 22,000 solo engagements, maybe it was time to stop cutting ribbons. The British public reacted with a strange mix of amusement and respect. Headlines joked about Britain's hardest-working nonagenarian finally taking a day off. But underneath the smirks was genuine awe. Prince Philip had been unfailingly present in the background of nearly every photograph, waving just behind the Queen, shaking hands with mayors, unveiling plaques, giving off the occasional inappropriate one-liner, and walking the calculated steps of a man who had long accepted second billing. And that was precisely what made his retirement so historic. The concept of a royal retirement didn't exist. Monarchs reigned until death. Consorts either died or faded quietly. But Philip, in keeping with his lifelong habit of defying expectations, introduced a new category: the non-reigning royal who simply steps back. In doing so, he punctured a myth at the heart of the monarchy, that royalty was not just a job, but a divine, unceasing state of being. Philip reminded the world, in his last public salute, that duty, even royal duty, had limits. But make no mistake, this wasn't a man slipping quietly into obscurity. His legacy loomed large. A former naval officer who had served in World War II, a reformer of palace operations, a man who walked 3 paces behind the Queen but always spoke his mind, often to the press's horror and the public's amusement. He helped modernize the monarchy from the inside out. He introduced cameras into royal life, yes, that documentary, pushed for streamlined operations, and founded the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, a program that would touch millions of young people globally. His role was always unofficial, but never unimportant. And now, he was doing what few royals dared, stepping aside on his own terms. His retirement marked a transition, not just for him, but for the monarchy itself. The royal family was aging. The Queen was in her 90s. Charles was quietly preparing for the inevitable. William and Harry were rising figures. And Philip's exit was a soft rehearsal for the harder departure the monarchy knew was coming, but rarely discussed. When Prince Philip walked off the public stage, he took with him an entire style of royalty: brisk, unsentimental, loyal to a fault, allergic to fuss. A style forged in war, tempered in protocol, and largely vanishing with him. And as Britain bid farewell to its iron-willed patriarch, a different kind of royal departure was already brewing. This one not at the end of life, but at the start of rebellion. Because soon, another royal couple would choose to step back, but not in silence, and not with permission. 30. Harry and Meghan. Step back from royal duties, 2020. The British monarchy, for all its pageantry and ritual, thrives on predictability. Roles are inherited, not chosen. Expectations are silent but heavy. And deviation, from protocol, from tradition, from family, is never encouraged. So when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced in early 2020 that they would be stepping back from their roles as senior royals, it wasn't just a break from routine. It was a constitutional hand grenade, lobbed in the most modern way possible, an Instagram post. The official statement was polite, vague, and surgically composed. They intended to carve out a progressive new role, to balance their time between the UK and North America, and to become financially independent. It read like a wellness retreat announcement. But underneath the polished wording was an unspoken truth. This was an exit. The media quickly dubbed it Megxit, framing it as a scandal driven by Meghan. But the roots went deeper, into family dynamics, institutional rigidity, and a growing tension between the monarchy and the modern world. This wasn't just about press intrusion, though that played a role. It was about control over image, voice, privacy, and purpose. And Harry, having grown up under the suffocating spotlight that played out during his mother's life and death, wasn't willing to watch history repeat itself. For Meghan, the experience of royal life had been more isolating than glamorous. From the moment their relationship became public, she faced relentless media scrutiny, much of it tinged with racism, class anxiety, and misogyny, dressed up as commentary. The palace, famously silent in times of crisis, offered little visible support. Behind the scenes, tensions brewed. The fairy tale was fraying. The real shock came not in their announcement, but in what followed: the negotiation. For the first time in recent memory, the royal family was caught responding publicly to a family member's personal decision and trying to contain it. Meetings were held at Sandringham. Statements were issued. It became clear this wasn't an agreed-upon transition. It was a rupture. Ultimately, the couple were stripped of their HRH titles, barred from using the word royal in their branding, and cut off from public funding. They moved to California, signed deals with Netflix and Spotify, gave a bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey in which accusations of neglect, isolation, and even racially charged comments about their child's skin tone were aired globally. The monarchy's response? A carefully worded press release. Recollections may vary. The Crown, once again, had misjudged the mood. The public was split. Some viewed the couple's departure as selfish. Others saw it as a brave act of self-preservation, especially from Harry, who had lost his mother to the same forces he believed were now turning on his wife. More importantly, the institution had been forced into the open, not by politicians or protesters, but by its own members. What had once been a family matter was now a global cultural flashpoint, refracted through race, mental health, generational divides, and media power. And though Harry and Meghan left the royal stage, they didn't disappear. They reinvented themselves, just not within the system. They became a different kind of royalty, self-branded, global, philanthropic, and untethered from titles. The monarchy survived the split, but the message was loud and clear. In a new world defined by personal agency, emotional transparency, and digital narrative, being born royal was no longer enough. You had to choose it. And just as the institution reeled from that choice, the world was about to be gripped by something far larger, a crisis that halted everything, silenced crowds, shuttered palaces, and demanded the Queen re-emerge not as a ruler, but as a voice in the void. 31. The Queen makes a rare public broadcast. During COVID, 2020. On the evening of April 5, 2020, as the United Kingdom stood gripped by uncertainty, lockdown, and an eerily quiet spring, Queen Elizabeth II appeared on television. Not for a Christmas message, not for a jubilee, but for a moment that felt as rare as it was urgent. Sitting in a green dress, backlit by quiet dignity and a single bouquet of white flowers, she looked straight at the camera and said, what no elected official, no news anchor, and no scientist could offer with quite the same weight. We will meet again. It was just 5 words, but they reached back across decades, anchored in history, and resonated like a hymn. This was only the 5th special televised address of her reign. A reign that had stretched across the Cold War, the fall of empires, and more than a dozen prime ministers. That she had chosen to speak now was not just symbolic. It was tactically symbolic. The world was paused. Streets were empty. Hospitals were full. The daily briefings offered graphs, restrictions, statistics, but no sense of national soul. And so, in that vacuum, the monarch stepped forward, not to rule, but to reassure. The moment was striking not because of drama, but because of its restraint. There were no grand proclamations, no platitudes about heroism, just a carefully measured voice, steady, calm, and laced with the kind of moral authority that no election can manufacture. She referenced her own wartime childhood, invoking memories of her first radio broadcast during World War II, when she and her sister Margaret spoke to evacuated children. That historical echo was deliberate. It reminded the public, without needing to say it directly, that this wasn't the first time Britain had been scared, or separated, or unsure of the future. The Queen wasn't offering a plan, she was offering perspective. And it landed. Millions tuned in. Social media, typically hostile to anything vaguely institutional, reacted with surprising softness. Even Republicans had to admit the moment had weight. The Queen had done what few could. She had shown up at exactly the right time, with exactly the right tone. Behind the camera, of course, things were less composed. The royal family, like the rest of the country, was in logistical disarray. Public engagements were canceled. Palaces were shuttered. Prince Charles had tested positive for COVID and recovered. Prince Andrew was, politely, nowhere to be seen. And Harry and Meghan had already relocated to California. The monarchy, famously choreographed, was now operating through webcams and contingency plans. But in that single speech, Elizabeth reasserted something crucial. That monarchy, in its best moments, wasn't about power or law. It was about symbolic constancy. When everything else vanished, routine, contact, certainty, the image of a queen still showing up, still saying something calmly human, carried weight beyond any constitutional document. And when she said, "We will meet again," she was quoting Vera Lynn, the wartime singer who had kept spirits afloat when bombs fell over Britain. It was a callback, a comfort, a promise. Still, no amount of televised composure could hold off what was coming next. Because in 2022, after 70 years of reign, Britain faced the moment it had quietly dreaded and carefully avoided for decades. The day the Queen herself would not return. 32. The death of Queen Elizabeth II after a 70-year reign, 2022. On the afternoon of September 8, 2022, the British public noticed something unusual. News anchors changed into dark clothing. The royal website went quiet. Parliamentarians were suddenly being handed notes. The phrase "under medical supervision" began to echo across headlines, followed quickly by an ominous, carefully worded update. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. And with that single sentence, an era ended. Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, and, for most people alive, the only one they had ever known, was gone. A reign that had begun in 1952 with trembling youth and post-war rationing had ended in 2022, in the digital age of memes, climate anxiety, and Zoom diplomacy. She had outlasted 15 prime ministers, 14 U.S. presidents, and more cultural upheavals than any single institution should reasonably survive. Her passing wasn't a surprise. She was 96. Her health had been declining and public appearances had become rare. Yet when the news came, it struck like a thunderclap, because you don't prepare for the death of a constant. The Queen had been a kind of national furniture, present in currency, stamps, schoolroom portraits, legal oaths, and national holidays. Her image was omnipresent not because it demanded attention, but because it simply was. And now, she wasn't. What followed was a ritual avalanche, carefully rehearsed over decades, yet surreal in real time. Operation London Bridge, the code name for the post-death protocol, was activated with military precision. Within hours, flags were at half-mast, mourning bands appeared, bells tolled 96 times. The BBC cleared its entire schedule, and across Britain and the Commonwealth, a kind of suspended animation took hold. People queued for hours, some for days, to view her coffin lying in state at Westminster Hall. Mourners camped on pavements. Strangers cried in silence. Tourists who had stumbled into history tried to make sense of it through their phone cameras. It was not mass hysteria. It was collective calibration. The machinery of monarchy, grief, and tradition moved in perfect, eerie unison. What stood out in the coverage wasn't just the volume of it, but the tone. It wasn't sycophantic. It was sober. Even critics acknowledge the historical weight of the moment. Elizabeth had been queen through Suez, through Thatcher, through Brexit and Diana, and COVID, and everything in between. She had never been a radical, never a reformer, but she had been there, unfailingly, unblinkingly. And now the world was left to ask, what happens next? For decades, speculation about the post-Elizabeth monarchy had been whispered, delayed, pushed down the news cycle. But now, Charles was king, not in theory, not in waiting, but in title, in ceremony, in reality. And as the nation watched the transfer of power, it also watched for signs of direction. What would the monarchy look like without its human anchor? Could Charles, after decades in the royal waiting room, carry the weight of something so defined by someone else? One thing was certain. The Queen was gone, but the institution remained, fragile, visible, moving forward by inertia, tradition, and necessity. And just months later, it would stage its next major performance. A coronation unlike any before it, one that reached beyond the Church of England and nodded, cautiously, toward a kingdom that no longer worshipped in unison. 33. King Charles III's coronation, featuring multi-faith participation, 2023. On May 6, 2023, Westminster Abbey once again hosted a royal coronation. But this time, something subtle and seismic unfolded beneath the layers of ancient ritual and gold-threaded robes. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the British coronation ceremony, a spectacle steeped in Christian liturgy, medieval precedent, and divine symbolism, featured multi-faith participation. In a monarchy where every gesture carries centuries of accumulated meaning, this wasn't just a nod to modernity. It was a departure from exclusivity, dressed in velvet and incense. King Charles III, long cast as a man waiting in his mother's shadow, finally took the crown, but not without leaving fingerprints on the occasion. The ceremony preserved all the expected elements: the anointing with holy oil, the orb, the scepter, the ancient coronation chair dating back to 1300. The grandeur remained intact. But alongside it, something new. Leaders from Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist communities playing symbolic roles in a ritual that once claimed exclusivity to Anglicanism. Notably, after being crowned, Charles received greetings not only from the Archbishop of Canterbury, but also from representatives of other major religions. It wasn't a full liturgical rewrite. This was still a Church of England ceremony, but it was unmistakably a message. A statement that the British crown, once the head of an imperial Christian order, now existed in a country of plural identities, beliefs, and cultures. It was also, in its way, personal. Charles had long shown interest in interfaith dialogue. Decades earlier, he'd raised eyebrows by suggesting he would be defender of faith, rather than the traditional defender of the faith, a carefully subversive tweak to a title that dated back to Henry VIII's papal flattery before the Reformation tore things apart. Critics, of course, weren't all applauding. Traditionalists accused the ceremony of diluting sacred meaning. Secularists saw it as another attempt to make monarchy palatable in a society that increasingly questioned its necessity. But for many, the gesture mattered. Not because it solved anything, but because it acknowledged something. That Britain was no longer a monolith, and neither was the institution claiming to represent it. Visually, it was striking. Saffron robes near ermine capes, turbans near tiaras, an archbishop placing the crown, and other faith leaders offering blessings. It was both jarring and oddly elegant, like someone had taken the tangled history of the empire and tried, however symbolically, to stage a kind of peace offering. Charles didn't just inherit the crown, he inherited a monarchy in mid-metamorphosis, one that had spent the 20th century reacting to crisis, scandal, and shifting public attitudes. His coronation was less about cementing power and more about justifying its continuation. Because the question still lingers in the background, ceremonial or not. What is monarchy for now? If not empire, if not religion, if not divine right, what exactly is being defended? The coronation didn't answer that question, but it reframed it. It offered a glimpse of a monarchy trying to remain symbolic in a world that increasingly demands substance, a monarchy balancing crowns with conscience, tradition with tolerance. And as the music faded and the crown settled on Charles's head, the message was clear, not final, but deliberate. This is not the end of monarchy's story, but it may be the beginning of its rewrite.